Well, I guess that is our cue. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Breaking Glass Forum, hosted here at Opera America. We are very excited that you all have joined us here live, as well as those who are joining us on the live stream. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Breaking Glass is a community engagement program created by the Glimmerglass Festival in Cooperstown, New York, and is an involving conversation involving opera artists, scholars, and the community about how we move beyond operatic stereotypes, embrace the grandness of the art form of opera, and its ability to tell stories that matter today, and to be critical about our role in presenting these stories within our communities. Glimmerglass, through a series of 8 national forums, holds a mirror up to themselves to discover what it means to be truly inclusive. As the social evolution of opera is changing, Glimmerglass feels the necessity to openly explore the social responsibility of an opera company beyond its artistic mission, particularly as it continues to explore the commissioning of work that explores Black stories and other non-Western European influenced operas. Through these conversations, we are finding connections with each other, shortening the distance between the word opera and audiences that find varying degrees of accessibility to our art form. The Breaking Glass National Forum series would not be possible without the support of many believers in the funding community who share the priorities of this initiative. The commissioning of Jeanine Tesori for Blue received funding from Opera America's Opera Grant for Female Composers program, supported by the Virginia B. Tolman Foundation. The development of Blue received major support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the production of Blue received funding from Opera America's Opera Fund, with additional support from the Amphion Foundation, Blue is supported by New Music USA, made possible by annual program support and/or endowment gifts from Mary Flagler Carey Charitable Trust, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the Helen F. Whitaker Fund, the Aaron Copland Fund for Music, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Anonymous. As we see, it takes much support to launch these new works, and we are very grateful to those who have provided the support for this forum and series, and as well as these operas. The Breaking Glass series of national forums and podcasts is also made possible by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and an Opera America Innovation Grant, supported by the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation. I am Matthew Morrison. I'm a assistant professor in the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at New York University, and I am happy and feel very privileged to be a moderator for these forums that we've been conducting now for the past year, and has just grown so much as we continue to explore and think through the possibilities of what it means to be truly inclusive and to aim for inclusivity within opera and art and beyond. So I will introduce very briefly our panelists as we launch into our discussion. To my right is Paige Hernandez, the librettist, stage director, and choreographer of Stomping Grounds. Next to Paige is Tazewell Thompson, librettist and stage director of Blue. Next to Tazewell Thompson is Jeanine Tesori, composer of Blue, premiering in Glimmerglass in 2019. Yes, next to Jeanine Tesori is Naomi Andre, Professor Naomi Andre, who's an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. And finally, we have Victor Simonson, who is a composer and also the composer of Stomping Grounds. Now, you all should absolutely read the longer bios that I did not read this morning. As you will notice that I am just surrounded by such a stellar group of artists and creators. So we're very happy to be here with you all. And now I can take a slight breather. So. Okay. So we are going to actually just dive right into the conversation that we are interested in having today. And I'll start by saying that we live in a time. We are living in a time. Do you all agree with that?
In a time.
We will get to the times that we're living in more specifically, but I will say that as we continue to hold dearly to our traditions and favorite operas of the past 200-300 years, we might also push ourselves as concert goers, board members, donors, administrators, performers to expand our aesthetic and ideological investments in tradition in an effort to really reflect the diversity of people, experiences, and styles that can push us towards a more regular and inclusive practice within opera and beyond. This is a space where that can actually happen and be done, and we're seeing it manifest through the work that you will witness today. And because the foundations of opera are often exclusionary, Focusing mostly on white, European, male, Anglo-American topics, people, and creators, we must be active in challenging these exclusionary norms, lest we find ourselves reinforcing many of the racist, sexist, and other supremacist structures that are at the base of our society and culture.
Victor just got a commission, so he had to leave.
So I would actually like to, thank you very much, Victor, for taking care of us there. I would actually like to now pass the mic here to my colleague, Naomi Andre, who will give us some thoughts on how we might, again, think about opera within a larger context. Naomi Andre is one of the premier scholars of opera and has a recent book titled Black Opera. So we are very fortunate and lucky to have her with us today. Naomi Andre, please, thank you.
It is really a pleasure to be here. And I just want to make sure.
You won't hear yourself. It's just
you won't
for
hear
the live
yourself.
stream.
Oh, okay, so this is fine.
Yes.
Okay. Normally I'm behind the scenes writing, but I do love talking about opera. And one of the things that we really get to do, and I just want to thank you guys for being here, for this audience, because we're doing something about looking at how to move forward. How do we take these ideas of diversity and inclusion and put them in a genre that hasn't necessarily been connected with that? We need to involve issues that look at power dynamics. We need to look at fear dynamics. And the fear and the power is both up here in terms of the composers and the people making the works, as well as in the audience and the people who are making decisions on boards. And how do we handle this? One wonderful thing is to get a large group of allies and apply for money and have the funding to do this and to get the attention. And I know that might sound like I'm singing for my supper or something, but odd metaphor, singing in this context, but the fact that these things take work and time and energy, and the fact that we're all here today is a really important part of that. We're looking at moving forward by bringing what I've been calling a shadow culture of opera, looking at people of color, particularly African Americans, here in the United States is what my work has looked at, but there's also other people of color, Asian Americans and Latino, or Latinx people here in the United States who have sung opera, who've performed it, and who love it and keep it in their communities, even if that sort of stays underground and doesn't come to the surface. My work has looked primarily at African American composers and the large number, not just Scott Joplin of Treemonisha, but also Harry Lawrence Freeman, who was working around the same time, born at the end of the 19th century, and was writing many operas. Columbia University got a donation a couple of years ago, and we found at least 20 operas in there. One of them, some of you in this audience might have known, Voodoo, was pulled together, and there was a concert performance at Columbia University in the Catherine Bache Miller Theater that went really well. So there are these operas. One thing I want to put out there is that these operas that are commissioned today do not come out of a vacuum, that there have been other operas, and an exciting thing is finding them and getting them performed. Once we perform them, and once we are, or as we are looking for them, I want to focus on something I call an engaged music approach, an engaged operatic approach. And we need to think about who's on the production team, sort of the first part of this. Who, when we commission new works, who are the composers and the librettists, the directors and the conductors? And then sort of whose stories are being told, who has the power to tell their story, who's giving good advice or censoring what's being told and how that's being told. Having an awareness that when you invite new stories in, it involves everything. It involves how the story is told. The second point, not just who's telling the story, but who are the physical bodies, because we talk about opera, and opera is lived on stage. It's different than reading a book or looking at a picture, that you get to have a version, a close connection to the original when it was first put up and first done. Here, we have works that were written in the past that are embodied by people today. And the second, or the third thing, so not just who puts the work on and whose story is being told, told, who's performing and living this performed art, but also who are we in the audience who are talking about it? Who is giving the critique, the review? What is being understood? Is there a background behind that? And we can use people who we know who can do a beautiful job with mainstream repertory, but do we need other voices that have insider knowledge to be able to explain these new stories? So I wanted to just open with that element about how we're moving forward, the fact that we have operas that luckily, it's always been an issue of operas having expression in different communities. We're just now bringing these voices more to a mainstream community. I want to say just a couple of quick things about Stomping Grounds and Blue, an incredibly innovative and insightful element about this program with the Breaking Glass and what Glimmerglass has done. And I don't work for Glimmerglass, so I'm saying that I get an honorarium, which is lovely, but I just want to say what's happening, and particularly for other people with Opera America. This was really insightful to have panels and discussions, to have podcasts that are put up, so it's got this multi-pronged view, and to commission 2 new operas. Stomping Grounds and Blue tell new stories and use new forms as well as a bunch of familiar things. With the new stories with Stomping Grounds, we're getting a story, and you'll get the actual creators behind it who will give a better version than I am. But basically, we're talking about how the present connects to the past and how people of color and people of the majority work together and bring together elements like finding elements, artifacts from the past. Having someone, a person of color, who wants to sort of get on this fast train of moving forward and then realizing, wait a minute, I might be kicking out an important community group here. So new stories like that, and we get new styles in Stomping Ground. We have an opera and opera singers, and we have something that perhaps more young singers can do. They can code switch into hip-hopera, and it actually can work, because we know opera is capacious and it can have many different forms. We've had jazz in opera, we've had serialism in opera, we've had, Puccini-esque singing, we've had parlando Rossini. We know that opera is capacious, it can do a bunch of things, and yet here's a really wonderful new current sound that we get in Stomping Grounds. New stories, new styles. Blue, unfortunately, this is not a new story, but perhaps on stage it is a new venue for this story. And this is where, again, you'll get more information about this in the past, but Blue refers to the Brotherhood of Blue and police officers, and what happens when we have, today, post 2002, with the killing of Trayvon Martin, during this time of Black Lives Matter, Michael Ferguson, Eric Gardner, the list goes on. You've heard these names. In this time where we in the present are living with these names and these stories, so it's not a new story, but is there a certain type of sacred performing space when we have people tell their stories about this, where we get to find perhaps not officially safe or entirely safe, but certainly a brave space, where we can watch together and witness how does a Black family, where the father is a policeman and the son gets killed by another policeman, how do we handle this? It's incredible, and it's incredibly timely. The style, the musical style, is all just like Victor Simonson. It's his voice and Paige Hernandez's voice in Stomping Ground. We have Tazewell Thompson's voice, lyrical voice, and Jeanine Tesori's musical voice with Blue. Both use operatic singers, both have their own style of the composers and the librettists, and yet both feel like operas, both work. I want us to think about how do these stories told by these people, interpreted by particular bodies and interpreted in terms of words and understanding by us, who have the power to keep going and supporting and thinking about these works. What is this saying about us as a country in this particular time? This is a really incredible opportunity to be able to think about this together.
Drop the mic.
You know, we are. It's really with this. What we have here again is an example of what it means to really work through these topics and these materials. And one thing I think we often do is imagine that the resources aren't available. That's a total myth. Naomi Andre, again, we have the premier scholar of Black opera, but also one of the primary musicological scholars on opera, who is able to provide both a context and a space for us to be able to be in dialogue with these creators and composers, so that we might better understand the work that it takes to really be able to not just launch these things, but to do it with care. And as Naomi Andre suggested, you know, how can we create and think about the operatic stage as a sacred performance space to work through these topics and issues? And so thank you very much for that, Naomi. And I think this is a great time to just go transition right to Paige Hernandez, who is the librettist, the choreographer. Paige just does it all. She's also a real life B-girl. You know, so breakdance,
right.
You know, graffiti,
I don't raise bee colonies, but hip hop is my thing.
Right. So Paige, if you can say, set up for us what we're about to witness here. Thank you, Naomi, also for giving us a short background into
Stomping
Grounds. But if you can give us a little context for what we're going to hear of Calling on the God Soon, which will be performed here for us by Victor Simonson and Stephanie Sanchez.
Yes. So hi, everyone. Hi, I can see you. Hey. I'm just happy to be here, delighted to share what the story is. Again, to have as many ears as possible on this type of story is really important and special to me, so thank you for being here. I'll be as concise as possible about what my hip-hopera is. Essentially, it's a hip-hopera, which means I did my best to try to use both musical genres in equal platforms, so holding up the hip-hop as well as the opera, in a way to just be relatable and fresh and cultivate newer and younger audiences. We had the great privilege to tour this throughout New York City, which was pretty great, as well as upstate New York. Essentially, Stomping Grounds is a gentrification story, but that story is a metaphor for home. In this coffee shop run by this Cuban woman, this Cuban entrepreneur, all of these different characters come to meet. We find out that their backgrounds are based in being natives, refugees, immigrants, as well as descendants of slaves. So we find out that our Cuban coffee shop owner's place is in kind of, you know, this peril of being gentrified by a up-and-coming kind of Black millennial. And we also find out that this coffee shop has magical coffee. So the coffee grinds tell different stories, like fortune telling in Cuba and in Turkey, but also this coffee heals. So it helps arthritis and cramps, and that's because one of the ingredients in this coffee is chicory, which chicory was used to cut coffee back in the Civil War, but it's also something that slaves drank a lot. We later find out that different abolitionists on the Underground Railroad would plant chicory as a kind of symbol and sign for slaves who were on the run, that this was a safe space, a place to go ahead and bury your shackles, bury anything that you might need, or that the slaves on the run behind you might use. What we find out is that this coffee shop has this huge garden in the back that's full of chicory. So that's kind of like that first moment in the opera when you're like, message! If you know the history of chicory.
Yes.
So what you're about to see is a very pivotal moment in the opera where our main character, Yessie, goes back to her garden to kind of dig and call on her chicory. In doing this, she calls on the gods. She's in a very, again, pivotal moment where she's trying to decide what happens next, and she's desperate. She may not be a religious person, but she's spiritual. So much so that she decides to use different languages to speak. She's literally speaking in tongues. And in order to go from kind of the English to the Spanish, she also calls on the African gods. And something about this piece that's super special, and we were talking about this before we started, is that this is really a moment where you don't necessarily see hip hop in opera, but this was kind of Victor and I's nod to salsa in opera. So really bringing in those Afro-Cuban rhythms and really using that as an expression. So we're really looking at the entire African diaspora. Something that you'll hear in this piece is something called the jibarita, which is a soulful cry that you hear throughout salsa music. So you're gonna hear this in anything out of Puerto Rico or Cuba. Mark Anthony does it the best, in my opinion. If you listen to some Mark Anthony, J-Lo be trying, but Mark Anthony really nails it. And that's the la lelo la lelo la, which is really an improvisation, but it's just a riff that's based in simple syllables. But that's the bridge that takes her from being able to speak one language and then code switch into the next. And then in this song, we get to hear, you know, some salsa and some kind of musical genre that we haven't heard yet in the opera. But all of that feeds into the hip hop, which comes after this in a very climactic moment. Victor, is there anything else you want to add, particularly about this piece that we're about to hear?
This
and I'm leaving out?
Because when she calls on the gods, it gives her the strength to then fight this battle for her land, for her coffee shop. And so without her doing this work of self-reflection, she's not able to go into the next scene, to go to the courthouse, to fight the millennial who's trying to take her shop. And so it's such a pivotal scene in the opera.
Yeah, and what we find out, spoiler alert, is that by her digging in her chicory, the same thing that's made her an entrepreneur, she ends up finding the shackle of a buried slave. So we find out that her coffee shop is actually on top of a burial ground of the Underground Railroad, which means they can't gentrify her building.
Yeah.
It's a historical site. We also find out that millennial who's been bullying her, he's a descendant of her garden. So that slave relic is directly tied to him. So lots of things are kind of happening. This is truly like the centerpiece or the very middle of the opera. Oh, one more thing. Stomping Grounds, just a play on grounds. So again, when needing help, whose ground do we stand on? Who came before us? Why are we walking in this path? Where does Opera America rent from? Do they own it? Where did they get it from? Do you know what I mean? It's thinking about all the footsteps that we've walked in. And knowing that when I walked in today, I walked through the footprints of probably some pretty amazing opera artists. And being mindful of that, being mindful of the ground that we walk on and when we can say it's ours and when we pass it on and what that means. So we're looking at coffee grounds. These are things that you're about to hear. Coffee grounds is reading, also the grounds that she's digging in, also the grounds that she rents but wants to own, also the grounds that she has to pass on.
Thank you. And we can welcome Stephanie Sanchez to the stage, who will perform as Jessie today, accompanied by Victor Simonson. We have the African diaspora, spirituality, gentrification, chicory, the Underground Railroad, salsa, bel canto, contemporary. In one excerpt, we have wrote so many things that could go past because you also are enjoying and engaged with the music itself. So we often imagine, I think, that when we engage with topics that may not be as common within opera or more contemporary or that are not a part of the canon, that somehow we compromise a musical aesthetic or integrity. Well, we've seen today that that is absolutely not the case. And so thank you very much, Stephanie and Victor, for your really beautiful performance of this selection.
Can we say something?
Please.
It was important to me again that there was a hip hop moment that was the equivalent to that aria. So Stephanie then later on in the second half gets to spit just like a straight up verse with that much intent and that much passion to feel the same feelings that you would in an aria through the hip hop verse. So being able to have both of those things exist in one piece still feels a bit unprecedented to me. And it was something that I think students, especially when we were on tour, could really relate to. Being able to see these two art forms and how she's able to, again, use opera and hip hop just like she's using Spanish and English. So it's all about the languages and the code switching in that way. Victor, I don't know if you had any.
Well, I was going to actually ask Victor and also Paige, please, in dialogue with her. Victor, if you could say whatever you want to say, but then also, can you say specifically about your process of engaging with Paige on translating the libretto into this sort of larger sonic space that really is a sacred, consecrated space in this performance aesthetic here?
Thank you, and again, welcome to all of you who are here. It is my honor to be here and to see this wonderful audience, both live and on the internet. We're grateful to be here, and this piece was exciting for me, particularly after Hamilton and the popularity of Hamilton, seeing the idea that hip-hop is culturally relevant. It's the music of a revolution. It's the music of a people who may not necessarily have had the opportunities to learn piano or violin, but have still an opportunity to express themselves. And so when Paige came to me with this libretto, the libretto came to me in verse. The entire opera essentially is rhymed, and it's also in rhythm, which is very unusual for the creation of an opera. Typically, a librettist will give the libretto to a composer and say, set the rhythm, set the melodies, set the text as you hear it in your mind. And I really wanted to honor Paige's intention in having the idea of this is how it sounds as a verse, because when you speak poetry at a specific rhythm and at a specific time, there's a specific emotion that comes out. And the singers, the artists who worked on this piece, we spent a lot of time codifying the language, talking about accent. We talked about the word swag, which essentially means you bring a certain spirit and a certain attitude to how you might say a particular text. And what we discovered was it's really hard to say this text in a way that's convincing and that's powerful. And it gave me, as a composer, a completely different appreciation for the medium of hip-hop. It's a celebration of hip-hop. It's a celebration of East Coast hip-hop. It's a celebration of West Coast. Southern, we have a lot of different styles of hip-hop in it. And so it's exciting because, again, it relates to this generation. And we look on television. It's in commercials. It's all over the place. It's a medium now where we're hearing sounds and rhythms that are captivating us. So for me as a composer, that was exciting. But for me as an African American, to explore what it means for me to be African American, to explore my roots and my heritage, and I was sharing with some of our cast before this forum, I'm a fair complexion. And I've always struggled with what does it mean for me to be black? Am I really black? Am I half black? Or am I not black? Because I'm such of a fair complexion. And I think living in that and really dealing authentically with this piece is about slave relics. It's about ancestors and exploring this idea of those of our ancestors who have gone on before us. And so for me, when I explore this, what themes can I use to best represent that? Well, when my brothers and sisters who passed away, my slave brothers and sisters passed away, when they worshiped, The one day they had to worship, they worshiped in the brush arbor and the brush fire.
Yeah.
Right? And what did they sing? What was that sound like? That sound was a guttural, earthy sound that was probably closest to what we now know as the blues. And Jeanine and Taz and everybody here understand the importance of the blues. And so what you heard in Calling to the Gods, when she calls the gods, you hear this doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. That is the blues. And in the beginning of this opera is full of references to this idea of the blues. And that is so critically important, to lift up that song of our ancestors. That is the song that they sang. And so in recognizing that song, I think that is a powerful connecting point in opera. And we see with pieces like Terence Blanchard's Champion, using jazz, using blues in opera is so, so critically important. Gershwin famously did this as well. In Porgy and Bess, he used the blues. And so it was so wonderful to be able to incorporate those two ideas in this opera.
It's really also amazing. The thing that opera has the potential for theater, is part of the reason why we go, is also for transformation. And I think a lot of the audiences need their minds transformed around ideas of how people who don't look like them exist. And so this opera presents such a dynamic and expansive consideration of sort of what African diasporicness is, especially within the context specifically of the U.S. So again, you have Cuban, you have Black American, you have we're dealing with various aspects of the diaspora, and so you have these very diverse experiences and presentations that are being also manifested through the music and the performance on stage. As Naomi and Andre pointed out, these things are realized by actual living bodies. And so again, it's not that, you mentioned Porgy and Bess, and so often it's something like Porgy and Bess. It is a monumental work that Gershwin is drawing on tropes of Black music performance, but it also becomes in many ways the singular way in which many people might imagine Black performers on a stage. And so this particular piece here gives us such a dynamic way to consider what Black performativity can be. Absolutely, please.
It was also very important that in telling this story, which is essentially a story of home, that we really looked at all of the immigration, refugee, crisis, as well as American Indian perspective. Whether this was a story about a Cambodian shop owner, just different people, Syria, I wanted to make sure it was something that everyone found an entry point, because it is such a common story. So it's not to get lost in a lens of one specific group, but the fact that this is truly worldwide and affects so many different people, so that you can really see it through that universal lens. And there were nods to that. One of Yessi's friends, who's in the audience today, one of our original cast, Rachel, she played the Turkish friend who also read Coffee Grounds. There were also Turkish rhythms and nods to that. So again, it was really finding a way to make sure that the audience knew that we saw them. That if I looked out into the audience of my opera, I could see this multicultural, multi-generational audience and know that they each had an access point. That's what inclusion looks like for me as a creator.
And so I'm going to sort of sloppily segue into Blue, because I just think that we want to get right to it, and then put these two works in conversation with the creators themselves. And so Jeanine Tesori, composer of Blue, this story about a Black police officer and his Black son and the Black mother and their community and family that you and Taz have been collaborating on for quite some time, and has been such a deep and thoughtful process. If you can maybe set us up for the Act 1, Scene 1 of Blue that we're about to witness here, Jeanine, and then, yes, if you can set us up here.
Okay, so Tazewell does that much better than I do. And also I love the way that Tazewell has this authority, which I wish that I felt, but I'm gonna let him.
The pressure.
I have many thoughts I hope that will contribute, but he really does this well. So
well.
I pass it the buck to you, my love.
As a child, I was always read to by nuns. I was in a convent as a child. And so stories and images and imagining characters and imagining settings by stories being read to me has always been a part of my life. the other thing is, as when I was introduced to coloring books, I didn't really color in the books. I held a crayon in my hand and I started to write. I liked seeing letters come together and see how they formed. Also, because a book, a story, a novel, a yarn, a fable, a fairy tale was being read to me, I wanted to somehow recreate that. So when Francesca Zambella approached me, and she first asked me, could I recommend to her librettists? And she also submitted some names and said, what do you think of these playwrights who could possibly write a libretto? Because I've asked Jeanine Tesori to compose an opera that has to do with what's going on in the world today in general, but specifically what's happening in our country in terms of politics and in terms of just the social strata of those who are not included or left out or misunderstood. And more specifically than that, she wanted an opera that dealt with race. So I wrote back an email immediately and I said, what about me as the librettist? And she wasn't really aware that I also write plays, and I've had many plays that I've written that I've fortunately had the opportunity to have them produced, and usually I directed them myself. I'd never written a libretto, so I was jumping into a territory that I had no knowledge of, except I worked as a director on opera. So when Jeanine and I got together, and she approved that I could be the librettist for this opera, I was thrilled and terrified at the same time. At the time that I was approached by this project, it was the summer where it seemed there was one shooting of an unarmed black boy who was playing with a plastic toy gun in a park, to a teenager who held up his hands and said, don't shoot, to a man who was running away from the police officers and was shot in the back. And it seemed that particular summer there was one incident after another. And so that was on my mind. And I wanted to address that in some way. It was important to me. I felt it was a responsibility for me to look into that in some way. And then myself as a black boy, black teenager, and now a black man going through the world, but more specifically here in this country and right here in the city, I have had my problems with police officers. So much to the extent, I was born in New York City, and I know the subway system like the back of my hand. I could actually sit in a booth and tell tourists which subway, car, or train to take to go to any part of the boroughs. But lately, I guess it must be about a year now, I'm terrified of going on subways, and I have put aside a little fund so that I take taxis or buses. I'm really very nervous about going, and I'll get over that eventually. But I have been stopped 3 different times in the subway by police officers. Once I was thrown so hard against a wall because the police officer said that I resembled somebody, and then 3 other police officers surrounded me, and it was a terrifying moment. I thought my life was over. And of course, I was not the person they were looking for, and I never got an apology or an explanation. Not only that, I was shoved and said, get on your way and stay out of trouble. So I started Blue in that framework. When the curtain rises, we see a black man on stage by himself in the void, and he's in civilian clothes. I'd say civilian because of something that happens later on in this prologue. He's dressed in jeans or very casual trousers, high-top sneakers, He's wearing a denim jacket or a leather jacket, and he has maybe a ball cap that's on backwards. And he looks out at the audience. And the audience they take him in how? As a lone black man on stage, as someone who is threatening, as someone they should fear. 3 police officers come on stage behind him and approach him. The 3 police officers are black police officers. And eventually we find out that the man who's standing on stage alone is also a police officer, and he changes in front of us out of civilian clothes into a police officer's uniform. In the first scene, which you're about to see, a mother-to-be calls on her 3 best girlfriends who she grew up with in Harlem. They all attended probably Howard University together. They all had dreams of changing the world in some way. And they knew each other since girlhood, hanging out around the streets of Harlem, which is where I live now. So I knew something about that. And she calls them all from their various locations where they live now. One is a teacher, one works, she's a lawyer, another one has her own small business. And they come back to Harlem because their girlfriend says, I need you need to come and be with me, I need your help. And we find out that the help that she needs is that she is married, pregnant, all a surprise to her, but more importantly, she's about to have a child, and she knows that the child is going to be a boy, and she's terrified of that fact. She wants very much to be a mother, but she knows that her baby boy will grow up to be a moving target. I'm speaking over this.
I know.
And now it's in place.
This is what my mind sounds like when I'm about to write music. It's like, so it's perfect, prelude.
So you're about to see really the opening moments of song of Blue. The 3 girlfriends gathering in their best girlfriend's apartment in Harlem, and they've been urgently called to come and advise her, help her, support her, rescue her in her moment of crisis. She very much wants to be a mother, but she's just terrified of what her child, she knows what her child is going to be, her baby is about to be. I don't think we get quite to that point, but we hear about the man that she's fallen in love with and what he does for a living.
I just interject before we start. The thing, if you read, I've been studying narrative for a really long time. I'll study it until the day I roll off a stage like this, and die. But if you go back to Aristotle and you really look, because I am a child of theater, and in that I find it really fascinating, and the idea that a character is innocent of one's fate. And yet, what we're looking at are 2 mythologies. The gods have somewhat decreed in this country that certain people are not innocent of their fate. And so there it is. We have decreed. And yet, inside every child born is the possibility that they have a path unknown to the gods. So it is not on an equal playing ground. And that is the tough thing dramaturgically about writing for a piece like this. Is in some ways we push these 2 forces that we know, in quotation marks, that we are fated to be, and that we hope and pray, therefore we move forward as the parents of someone whom societies or a culture. So it deals with police criminality being the code word, not brutality, criminality because it is a crime. And that is not to say that we have decreed that all of any one people. There is a complication inside the deeds of a few that stand for many, there are many, all of these police officers of the law who every time they go out the door put their lives on the line. That is not true for me. I sit at a piano bench, my life feels like it's on the line, but it is indeed not. So these are the complications, the prismatic look at what we are trying to do and are in process, which is why it's delightful to be on a panel, because the work isn't finished.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Should we step off?
We should.
A slow curtain rises. Lights reveal a bare, empty, vacant stage. A void, non-existent of time and place.
This is
A
the
mist
mind
hangs
part.
over the stage. Eventually, a striking black male, known as the father, in his late 20s, emerges through the haze. He steps forward downstage, looks out, and slowly and deliberately surveys the entire audience. He's in contemporary urban wear, faded jeans, sweatshirt, high-top sneakers, a soft shell or bomber or leather jacket, and a ball cap turned backwards on his head. After a time, 3 black police officers enter onto the space, line up, and then surround the father. Soon, in an intentional choreographed routine or ritual, the police officers assist the father in stripping out of his civilian clothes and meticulously replacing them head to toe with his police officer blue uniform. The last items are his heavy utility belt containing an assortment of police gear, his nightstick, and most especially, his revolver. Finally, seeing himself in the mirror, the audience, he crowns himself with his police officer lid. He is ready for duty. Lights.
Jeanine is a badass director.
Middle-class Marlon Foundation. The character known as the mother is 9 months pregnant. She's surrounded by her 3 best girlfriends.
It's really amazing to have had the opportunity to witness the growth and development of Blue over time. And so you can go and listen to some of the previous sessions, forums, as well as the podcast to hear some other excerpts, because it's really powerful the way that Jeanine and Taz have collaborated to really tell what is and a possibly difficult story, but one that is an unfortunate and regular reality. So thank you all for your work and for that excerpt, and what a magnificent performance that we saw in the workshop here. So this is I would like to actually throw the buck to Jeanine here, and then open it up for a dialogue between the collaborators to think about what is this process of collaboration for these types of work. All of you all have collaborated in many venues and settings, of course, as the consummate artist that you are, but this is a very specific space. And so can you say a bit, Jeanine, about your process musically and otherwise of setting maybe even this scene or other parts, as you also, along with Taz, say a bit about what this larger dynamic has been like for you in the creative development of Blue.
I miss that sound. You guys miss it? Kidding. Tough crowd.
I just got it.
I know, right?
It was a little delayed.
Okay, so this is a really difficult space to live in. It's a difficult space as a composer, because I find that when I write, I feel like, do you remember the deep sea divers when they had those giant, we had an aquarium when I was a kid, and we had one of those like crazy guys with the mask, right, the bubble head, and the bubbles coming out, and that's what I feel like when I compose. I go all the way down, and then it takes me a while to come back up. And shows generally take, Fun Home took 7 years to make. And you don't really, you're not compensated. You don't make any money. If you make money, it's after the fact. It's ex post facto that anyone in this business makes money. We don't get paid to write, none of us get paid. You get commission, but you can't live off of that. And thank God for women like Cesca Zambello, because she is responsible for so much of my career in terms of saying, you can do this. And that's what we need. We need particularly women bringing other women along, taking the machete and saying, you can do this. And if you fail, that's okay too. Yeah. But you can do it. You can attempt it, you can stretch. And inside this idea that she wanted an opera about race, and I was like, really? Because hey, but which one of these people is not like the other? That would be me. But the thing is, I am willing, I was telling Tazewell, it's not like, I am not an officer of the law. I do not put myself in harm's way when I go out. I am not a woman of color. I do not walk the walk of a woman of color when I get out. So the least I can do is put my blood and my soul into this piece. So I can visit in a way of what these characters might be narratively. I've studied narrative forever. I will study it till the day I plop off. But the thing about this piece is about disruption for me. It's a disruption inside what should be. Dramatic characters should be innocent of the moment to come, like I said before. But certain people in this country who are not seen or not heard, which is the definition of justice. I actually took civil procedure at Columbia Law School, so I could understand how metaphor inside the justice system works or doesn't work. Because I was interested, and they're like, who's that old white lady in the back of the room? And the teacher was like, oh, that's what white old lady is. Jeanine Tesori, she's studying precision of language, and they turned around and they're like, whatever. But I was really absolutely blown about what justice is and the way that metaphor works in the justice system, which is two people play out your stories on the stage, which the Greek used to call the orchestra with a K, and now that has a different meaning for us. But the playing space is not level in this country. And that was very interesting to me to study from a narrative point of view. And when Taz and I would go back and forth, I think theatrically in space, it was very painful and very wonderful to work this way, but that's not the way plays or opera work. They don't work at music stands. You must put something in time and in space, because a gesture, like for me, like a Brechtian gesture of why I look at you, and it says everything. So when we are working, we are also trying to see what are the stakes, what is the capacity for joy inside this piece that is going to end up tragically, but we have to balance that so we understand what the disruption is of the life that was not led. And that, is the first act is all about possibility. And the second act is that the idea that it was never going to be possible for this particular man because of the fate that was decreed for him by others, that he was not. People closest to the problem are usually farthest from the solution. And so all of these things come to being, and the thing that we were talking about back there is dramatically we have to be so on top of it because in opera there's no preview. So we're working feverishly to work out all of these things, and I'm used to a really long span of time to work out these things, and also really listening and not yammering on as much, to really listen. This is Tazewell's story in terms of how his point of view, he has an ownership. It is my story in that I must understand the humanity inside of it in order to put myself on the line.
Tazewell and Paige, if you all can say as librettists a bit about, for you, the process of narrating the stories that you're telling, and also thinking about narrating them to be set to music, because you understood that was a part of the process. And so if you can say a bit about that, maybe if you can start, Taz.
It was a huge, huge, huge lesson in terms of what a libretto really means, in terms of how the music enters in, how the voice needs to come in, and how I write every day. I keep a journal ever since I was a child. I write things down every day. I cross the street, I'll go home, right? I cross the street and I saw so-and-so. And it's a good exercise, and I never meant to mount to anything. It's just something that I've always done. And I'm used to, either as a director, working alone until I'm in a room full of singers or actors, or in production meetings with designers, or in auditions with a casting director and actors coming in. And to work on this libretto with a composer was astonishingly major learning experience for me. Because I wrote, and I was writing a lot of stuff on the page, where eventually what I wanted to say in a paragraph had to be pared down to maybe 2 sentences, or sometimes a word, or 3 words that might end up being repeated, or that Jeanine would take something that I have written and she would edit things down, and then something that would come later would show up earlier as a counterpoint to something that was being sung 3 pages earlier. And that was a wonderful lesson for me, and it never felt like I was being cut out or bruised or punched around or thrown around. It was part of this wonderful collaboration of what putting together an opera is like. I've directed musicals, and there's a book, and then someone will sing a solo or a duet or a trio, or a whole chorus will sing. But an opera is very, very different, as you all know. Once the curtain goes up, it's singing all the way through. So what is my job then, as to tell the story, to flesh out the characters, not too much, but enough that it gives clues, or a scaffold, or a blueprint, or a piece of construction, so that the flesh and blood and heart and soul and spine, that is the music, can enter in. And that was a great, great learning, and I'm still learning because we're still working on it. What you saw on the screen was the workshop that just happened, I think just maybe 2 weeks ago at Glimmerglass, after 4 days of rehearsal. And all the singers were involved with singing 4 other operas at night, so we only had them for a limited amount of time. And I'm sorry that you got profiles or backs of the lead, the mother in the opera, but nonetheless, from that, we also know that we had to go back and look at scenes, lines, parts of the score, the libretto. Cheska gave some wonderful notes, but my work as a librettist is feeding into the idea of yes, you have a story you want to tell, the story is something that's familiar to you, but then you've always got to remember, or at least I learned to remember that how does the music enter in, and what can I take away before Jeanine picks up these clues, these keys, these particles of pieces of mysteries that she pulls together so brilliantly to make a score.
Yeah, I wrote mine like a hip hop album. I did tracks on the album and the stories within the liner notes. There was also just tons of hip hop references. So I leaned on kind of the vernacular and the canon of hip hop music to write the styles in which I wanted to have urgency. So a lot of 90s hip hop, Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul. There's even a scene called Stakes is High. And then I have a lot of credit to give to Victor, because he's the one who said, oh, you're writing that with the drive of like Salt and Pepper and, Queen Latifah, but in opera that's like a Puccini. And so we had to really share playlists. I remember you made me a gospel playlist, but also all of the opera reference. This is my first libretto. So I wrote it like that, but it meant that I had like 3 hours of material. And then I just started scaling back. It was a lesson in being as collaborative and flexible as possible. Because once you get in the space, or actually once I sent the text to you, it was like, this is too many words. Let's cut that, let's repeat that, let's find motifs in them, let's find ways to recognize characters through different musical points. And then once we got in the room, some more cutting happened. And now, we're going on tour for middle school, so some more cutting happened. So I just wrote the best way I knew how. I'm also a playwright, but I had never written something entirely in verse. It rhymes from top to bottom. So I really wanted to look at it as kind of my hip hop. Paige in Full is my nomer. As the Paige in Full kind of masterpiece album. And then really relied on Victor to just kind of let the opera come through and sing.
So I'm going to actually open up the conversation to the audience if there are questions. And before we do so, I would just like to point out something that I think is really important about the process that has been discussed by our creators here, and is that everyone here is a researcher. And I think it's often assumed because, so Lydia Guerrero wrote this text, The Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, which really talks about how the canon is developed, especially within the Western art music system. And we often take for granted, especially within opera, that these works just appear. Well, they've been around hundreds of years. They've been workshopped many times, have many productions. And so for these new works to be staged with these new topics, and also with first-time librettists, this is also how you get new people into the space to create these works. We have 2 first-time librettists who are also doing, really, we talked about the word master, right, and mastery, but masterful jobs at this work. And so and we often also assume that because people are coming from non-white backgrounds, that the work that they're doing is kind of natural. Well, again, as Paige and Victor and Taz have discussed here, and also Jeanine, every step has required some very direct type of research or engagement with the material that goes way beyond just imagining that one is creating something that is just coming naturally from oneself, even though it is highly informed, again, by one's own nature in many ways. So it really is, I think, important to emphasize the need for workshopping through and moving through these developments of new works of this type and these caliber, as well as with these topics, but the patience it requires. And I think you said something very important. It's okay if things fail, because many white dudes have failed over the years at opera. And so give some other folks a chance as well as things develop.
But just to say really quickly, research, we often think about, we reduce it, but research of oneself, taking inventory, and the training of, I've been training in context talks and how to talk about race as a white woman, how to become a white anti-racist person, which is a path. And really looking, so when we say research, I think it's also the research within to say, how should I set the N-word? Well, why is it on a low F sharp for a bass? It's like, because that's how I feel that it sounds. So those notes and those setting and the use of tessitura also come from some painful realizations of the racist mechanics and infrastructure within. And it's very painful to reveal it because you have to reveal it and hear it before you write it.
And the research is self-reflexive. Questions from the audience. I think that, is there another microphone or is this the, okay. Thank you, Victor.
I think you just answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway.
Oh, it's like Jeopardy.
In doing the writing and composition and the like, do you move toward words and idioms, let's just say provocative words and idioms from a racial point of view, or do you move away from them? In other words, is it approach or avoidance? Because that's, you have human nature. You're usually approaching and avoiding. I'd be interested to know how psychologically you think about or deal with those two challenges.
I never use the N-word, ever. Never. When I hear it in movies or in plays, and if it has context, then I accept it. I don't like hearing it in the world. I don't like hearing it anywhere. In my research, or rather in my growing up, as I was reading about that word and where it comes from, I remember when I was working on a play that I wrote about Ida B. Wells, who was born in Mississippi, but the main thrust of her life that took her around the country was that she started to record lynchings. And I remember in something that she wrote, she said the last thing that this person, the last word that this person, a woman, a man, child, all black, who were strung up and sometimes set on fire, was she heard the crowd yelling and shouting and screaming the word, that word. And that stayed with me. And so no matter how anyone tries to appropriate it and said, well, it's our word, we can do whatever we want with it, I never accept that. However, when it came to writing this libretto, there was a moment that I felt I had to use it, and it was actually painful for me to put it in. And Jeanine has already described how it should sound, but it needed to be in that moment because the police officer, the black police officer in Act 2, says, this is how the world sees me. They see me as this word. And so to answer your question, you have to decide, do you want to be real, as authentic as possible? I remember in my research, I interviewed a couple of black police officers. And originally the libretto did not have police officers, and it was Jeanine's idea that the father should be also a police officer, and that was a startling, I immediately said, no. And then an hour later, before the meeting was over, I said, my reaction is actually, is fascinating, but because that's the conflict right there. How does a black police officer father react to not only losing his son, but losing his son to a fellow police officer who is white? And so in my research, as I interviewed these two different black police officers, both of them have said that as they've passed through their community, either in uniform or out of uniform, the community knowing that they were police officers, that word has been hurled at them. And so I guess I went on and on about it. I hope I answered your question.
Also, who's going to commission Taz to write this libretto for an Ida B. Wells opera? Okay, but next.
I think it'd be interesting for Paige. I know we brought a hip-hop opera, and as we know, hip-hop music is full in many cases of artists who use very vulgar language that may be disorienting for many. So Paige, I don't know if you want to talk about your idea.
Yeah, this definitely came up. It is a music and a culture that I love. I'm also in love with the evolution of it, no matter how terrible it is right now. But I like Cardi B, so, But all of my work aims to be multi-generational, which means students and youth have to experience it, for me. It's really about looking at hip-hop at its purest essence, which means it's actual 4 elements when it was about unity, peace, and having fun, and stopping gang violence. So there wasn't much of that word then. I mean, if I look specifically at the moment in hip hop that really inspires me, we're talking about like Curtis Blow, Eric B. and Rakim. So that's pretty much where I live and where I stand and where I create artistically. So I do stay away from it. I've mentioned this before, but it's not really in my interest to kind of excite this activists in students or in the youth. It's really to just make them aware. It's to show them everything that's there in different perspectives, and then empower them to make the choice about that given subject, which means I won't be using things that are controversy or complicated without giving the context, like you said, but it's not something that I set out to do.
There's an opera by Philip Glass, Appomattox, that I directed in Washington. And the rehearsals came to a halt. The entire company wanted to get together because in Act 1 of that opera, and especially in Act 2 of Philip Glass's opera, Act 1 is set in 1865 and Act 2 is set in 1965. That word is used. And the company was extremely uncomfortable with it and angry and upset. And so Philip Glass and the entire company, we talked about it. And in the scene in Act 2 is based on a true incident where a man is pursued by a group of whites, black man is pursued by, and his family, and they run into a bar to hide, and this mob comes in and they start, where is the N-word, where is that whole N-word family? And we had to use it. It's historic, it's based on a true incident. And so, I finally said, well, what should we say? Should we say, where is that person of color? Where is that, whatever, fill in the blank and not say that word? Doing that is excusing and forgiving and accepting and humanizing that moment of those horrific people who not only found them in the bar, but took them out and slaughtered them and beat up the child. So you have to face that moment. And it was good, though, that the company had that reaction. They have to sing it, and they have to hear it. And we got through that moment, and they understood. And that moment, sung by the chorus, was sung with such fervor and ferocity. It was actually a great moment in the opera because they understood the context and why they had to sing it.
I think we might have time for one more question. Yes, please. Thank you, Victor.
Hi. First off, thank you so much for this discussion. I think it's so amazing that we actually do have like a time and a space where we actually get to open up and talk about these things. Growing up Asian Canadian, I've often lived vicariously through seeing so much social progression and so much pride in African American progress through media, and often with the thought in the back of my heart that eventually, other marginalized people of color would also have their own stories represented. And now that we're going towards this discussion of race and diversity, I just want to know what your thoughts are in terms of, do we Asian Americans, Asian Canadians have a place in opera, or at least a place in sharing the stories of African Americans?
Jeanine just wrote a piece about soft power.
No, it's really important. It's very important, and I welcome that. David Henry Hwang writes many libretti. I think he's written 10. And An American Soldier just premiered, I think, right in St. Louis. It was really, and I think that we go back to the entry point. So he's written the 10,000 hours of how we make sure that Asian Americans, Asians and that it's not, you know, there are some very, very tricky, you can be, it's just Asian, you're just Asian. It's like, well, no, right? There's Korean and Japanese and Filipino. It's not just this like Asian experience, and that comes with being at the table and listening very carefully. We wrote a musical with an all Asian American cast called Soft Power that was done, and it's about the retelling of The King and I from an Eastern point of view. There's only one white character in it, and I'm one of the very few white people on the team, and sitting inside the experience of when we'd round table. What's most important, what's equally important is what happens here is what happens there. Matthew and Naomi were saying, I wish that we could tape our discussion the hour before when we were in production, because that's where it happens, really. That's, as Lynn would say, that's the other room where it happens, the smaller room where it happens. And there was a young actress inside the room when the director opened up to say, before we embark on this story, we have to level the idea of ownership, so that you're not just chess pieces out there, but as Asian American men and women, that we, and one of the Asian women said, I feel like in musicals, if I'm not bowing, I'm opening my legs. And I live inside shame, inside the repertoire, and and I thought, we have to hold space for this discomfort, hear her, and then we will go forward. But I will never forget that moment.
Wow.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm part Asian heritage. My mom is Chinese and Black, and it was important to me to make sure that my cast was as well-rounded and as diverse as pretty much me looking into the mirror and making sure that there was an Asian voice represented. But I have to say I came up against some pushback where it wasn't necessarily encouraged. So it was also just these moments where we find ourselves silenced, or someone gives us a choice, and then we have to say no, just because maybe, you know, and then there's all these difficult conversations. Maybe we won't find that opera singer who is of this background and blah, 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 as if they don't exist. Right. But really just not curious and exploring whether or not it's there.
Because we know they're there.
Yeah, we know they're there. So it was really about a presence, an awareness, the courage to not say no, to be at the table, to be at these backstage conversations. And then, you know, it's hard because of mixed race heritage. It's almost like I have to lean on which one I'm going to fight for that day. You know, and African American is all the rage because of the majority that it falls in within the minorities and the American culture. But then I also just feel like Asians are having their shine right now too, you know, with like Crazy Rich Asians, and like I just saw Searching. So I'm thinking about all these ways where I'm seeing representation that I haven't seen before. And that was also why it was important for me to mention things about the Cambodian refugee crisis, about Vietnam within the piece, and have those kind of embedded. Because again, those are really just things that are there, that if you're in the audience, you'd be like, ding. Do you know what I'm saying? And then be able to bring you in further in that way. I don't know if that addresses your question specifically, but it's really about finding where those intersections happen and then making sure that we hold each other up the best way we know how. And I just wanted to also give a plug at this time, because we're getting close to the end, for our podcast. So Breaking Glass is forums, and it's also a podcast hosted by moi and Tazewell Thompson. So if you really enjoyed the discussion that you heard today, you can check out the podcast. The same place you can check out more about the forums. This was live streamed today, so you can share it with your friends, this link. But you can also continue to listen to the podcast, and that's at glimmerglass.org/breakingglass. And we've got some really great artists talking about different experiences in opera, really looking at social issues and diversity and inclusion when it comes to kind of breaking that glass in opera. So we hope you check it out. It's #1 on iTunes.
You know, we've done about 8 of these, but we've never had these 2 questions like this.
Yes, these are wonderful questions.
This was really great questions.
So with
that deal specifically with what we're about here.
Absolutely. We could continue this conversation, and I'm always like, how did we get here? I only got through half of my script, but here we are at the end of our chat. So what we really hope is that this just opens and continues to push a dialogue and conversation that just does not stop at the conversation, but that manifest in tangible shifts and changes. That requires that patrons, that requires that donors, that requires that all of us who are in this room, that we spread these words, we become acolytes of sorts, right, for what it means to really think about pushing the discourse and pushing the art field into really thinking about what it means to be inclusive, because we all are better for it when we do it. And if we don't do it, then we actually are being actively exclusive. And I don't think that that is what we want to do as human beings. So thank you all. Oh, I'm
Can I
sorry.
get one more thing?
Please.
We have a survey, actually. So if there's not a question that we answer today or that we don't do afterwards, or for all of you watching on the internet,
Yes.
you can fill out the survey. It's at that same link. Because if there's a question that we didn't explore, we'd love to explore it in the podcast.
Yes.
So please keep the conversation going and let us know what you thought about today.
And thank you so much to our producer, Christopher Powell. Yes. You all were an amazing audience. Thank you to Opera America, and we hope to see you at the premiere of Blue. Okay, there we are. I know, right?